Imagine waking up one day to discover that everything you thought you knew about the world was a lie. That's what happened to the people of Northern Europe when they finally received news of Christopher Columbus' incredible voyage. The Nuremberg Chronicle, an illustrated world history from the creation to the present, was printed on July 12, 1493, but it made no mention of Columbus' voyage. It was as if the world had suddenly shifted, and nobody knew it. Not until late March 1496 did the news reach England, and the first German translation of Columbus' letter wasn't printed until 1497. This delay in information might seem bizarre to us today, but in the 15th century, news traveled slowly, and the world was full of mysteries. Christopher Columbus' news was explosive. He claimed to have found a new route to the Indies, the fabled land of spices, silks, and untold riches. His first illustrated Latin edition of the report, printed in Basel in 1493, carried crude woodcuts that were already used in earlier Swiss books with no connection to Columbus, the Indies, or the New World. One woodcut showed Columbus landing in the Indies in a 40-oared Mediterranean galley, while another depicted the Bahama Islands as a typical South European seaside village. These images were far from accurate, but they captured the imagination of a world hungry for new discoveries. Columbus, a determined and persuasive man, had convinced himself that a trip across the Western Ocean would take him to the Indies. He was so convinced that he set out to convince a wider audience. His vested interest in his destination being the Indies was enormous. In his first public announcement of his momentous voyage, Columbus was careful to omit any mention of disasters or near disasters, such as the loss of the flagship Santa Maria, the insubordination of Martin Alonso Pinzon, the commander of the Pinta, or the mutinous spirit of the crew. He also omitted information on the courses taken, or the precise distance covered to prevent competitors from following in his footsteps. Columbus conceded that he had not actually seen the Great Khan or the court of gold-rich Cipangu, but he detailed numerous clues reinforcing his belief that he was just off the coast of China. The resplendent Great Khan, he was confident, would be found just a little farther on, doubtless on the next voyage. Columbus was a keen observer of the winds and waves, but when it came to the crucial question of where he had arrived, he was a slave to his hopes. He was determined to find signs everywhere that he had reached the fringes of Asia. Botany, which was still a vague and poorly understood field, became his happy hunting ground. From the moment he first touched the north coast of Cuba on his first voyage, he had no trouble finding the Asiatic flora. A shrub that smelled like cinnamon he eagerly called cinnamon, a hint of untold spice treasures. The aromatic West Indies gumbo limbo, he insisted, must be an Asiatic form of the mastic tree of the Mediterranean that yielded resin. A small inedible nut, the nogul de pies, he hastily mistook for the coconut described by Marco Polo. The ship's surgeon examined some roots that the men had dug up and obligingly pronounced them the valuable medicinal Chinese rhubarb, a strong cathartic drug. However, it was actually the common garden rhubarb that we now use for pies and tarts, not the pharmacist's room officinale. But so many false scents somehow seemed to add up to the authentic odor of the Orient. One of the most significant encounters on Columbus' first voyage was his expedition into Cuba. On October 28, 1492, Columbus' caravels entered Bahia Barrié, a beautiful harbor in the Orient province of Cuba. There, the captive San Salvador natives whom he had brought along as interpreters interviewed the local Indians and told Columbus that there was gold at Cubanacan, which they mistook for El Gran Khan, the Great Khan of China. Columbus eagerly sent an embassy to meet the Oriental potentate. An Arabic-speaking scholar whom he had brought along for just such missions was put in charge, accompanied by an able seaman who had once encountered an African king in Guinea. They took along diplomatic paraphernalia, including their Latin passport, a letter of credence from their Catholic majesties to the Chinese emperor, and a rich gift for the Khan, along with glass beads and trinkets to buy food en route. Led on by visions of Cambaluc, the Mongol capital of China, they hiked up the valley of the Qiqiyuguin River. What they found were some 50 palm-thatched huts. The local cacique feasted them as messengers from the sky, and the people kissed their feet. But they got no word of the Great Khan. On the trail back to the harbor, Columbus' two ambassadors had an epochal encounter. They met a walking party of Taino Indians, each carrying a long cigar and herbs to drink the smoke thereof. This was the first recorded European encounter with tobacco. Obsessed by visions of China's gold, Columbus' embassy saw only a primitive custom. Some years later, when the Spaniards had colonized the New World and learned to enjoy tobacco themselves, they introduced it to Europe, Asia, and Africa, where it became a source of wealth, delight, and dismay. Meanwhile, Columbus remained back at the harbor, working up the figures from his dead reckoning to confirm his conviction that Cuba really was Marco Polo's province of Mangi. He occupied his spare moments gathering the botanical specimens that he believed could not be found anywhere except in Asia. The conspicuously pious Christian nomenclature that Columbus affixed to the lands he first visited. It was his divinely appointed errand to enlarge the realm of the true faith with the souls of pagan millions. His confidence as God's messenger had given him the strength to bear years of ridicule, to risk mutiny, and would continue to shape his views of world geography. Columbus' first voyage had many features of a Caribbean cruise, as he mainly enjoyed the sights and sounds and curiosities he could witness from the coast, with only occasional short excursions inland. He had speedily coursed through the Bahamas, then skirted the northern coasts of eastern Cuba and of Hispaniola. Just 3 months after he first sighted the land of the Indies, the island of San Salvador, his caravels set sail on January 16, 1493, from Samana Bay on the eastern end of the island of Hispaniola to return home. After only so brief a journey to the peripheral islands, with so little experience of the interior and such ambiguous clues to the Oriental character of the country, Columbus remained undaunted in his faith. His report revealed no doubt that he had reached the Indies. He generalized with all the confidence of the quickie tourist. The natives, he asserted, were so ingenuous and free with all they have that no one would believe it who has not seen it. Of anything that they possess, if it be asked of them, they never say no. On the contrary, they invite you to share it and show as much love as if their hearts went with it, and they are content with whatever trifle be given them, whether it be a thing of value or of petty worth. In all these islands, I saw no great diversity in the appearance of the people, or in their manners and language, but they all understand one another, which is a very singular thing, on account of which I hope that their highnesses will determine upon their conversion to our holy faith, towards which they are much inclined. The place he chose for La Villa de Navidad was in the best district for the gold mines, and for every trade both with this continent, and with that over there belonging to the Grand Khan, where there will be great trade and profit. To their Catholic highnesses he promised as much gold as they want if their highnesses will render me a little help, besides spices and cotton, as much as their highnesses shall command, and gum mastic, as much as they shall order shipped in aloe wood, as much as they shall order shipped, and slaves, as many as they shall order, who will be idolaters. During the next 12 years, Columbus undertook 3 more voyages to the Indies. They were called voyages of discovery, but more precisely, they should have been called voyages of confirmation. For someone less committed, these voyages might have produced tantalizing puzzles, planting seeds of doubt. When these successive voyages still failed to connect with the Great Khan or to discover Oriental splendors, it became harder to persuade others back home. Although Columbus was ingenious at inventing new strategies of explanation, as his explanations became increasingly far-fetched, he once again became a butt of ridicule, a casualty of his own faith. Only 6 months after returning from his first voyage, Columbus set out again. This time, his expedition was on a far grander scale. Instead of 3 small caravels, he had an armada of 17 vessels and at least 1,200 men, still no women, including 6 priests to oversee the work of conversion, numerous officials to enforce order and keep books, colonists hoping to make their fortunes in the Indies, and of course the crew. While the first voyage could have been called merely exploratory, this second voyage was planned to make the exploration pay off. Columbus was now commissioned to set up a trading post in Hispaniola. He was under greater pressure than ever to prove that he had found the fabled treasure trove of the Indies. This time, Columbus' feat of seamanship was even more impressive. While crossing the ocean, he managed to keep the 17 ships together, and as Samuel Eliot Morison boasts, Columbus hit the Lesser Antilles at the exact spot recommended by sailing directions for the next 4 centuries. His actual discoveries were also significant, as he found the Lesser Antilles, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico, explored the south coast of Cuba, and established the first permanent European settlement on this side of the Atlantic. Still, for Columbus, this was not enough. He demanded the shores of Asia. On this second trip, as Columbus proceeded through countless small islands of the Lesser Antilles, he was encouraged by recalling Sir John Mandeville's observation that there were 5,000 islands in the Indies. By the time he reached the southern tip of Cuba, he was convinced that he had reached the mainland of Asia. As he coasted Cuba westward from the Gulf of Guacanayabo, he was confident that he was following the shores of Marco Polo's Mangi in southern China. When he reached Bahia Cortes, a point where the coast turns sharply toward the south, he knew that he was at the starting point of the eastern shores of the Golden Chersonese, the Malay Peninsula. If he had not yet found the sea passage that Marco Polo said would lead him to the Indian Ocean, he had found the peninsula at the end of which the sea passage would surely appear. But at this point his caravels were leaking, his ship's rigging tattered, his supplies low, and his crew showing signs of mutiny. Columbus decided to turn back, a pity. If he had gone only 50 miles farther, he could have discovered that Cuba was an island. To protect himself against accusations of timidity or cowardice, and to confirm his geographic ideas, Columbus extracted sworn depositions from the officers and crew of all the 3 ships which he had detached for this exploring sally. This was not an unprecedented procedure, as Columbus must have known. Only 6 years earlier, in 1488, Columbus had been at Lisbon when Diaz returned, and had to justify his reversing course at the critical moment when he had clear sailing to India. Bartholomew Diaz had taken this same precaution to prove that it was his crew that forced him to return. But while Diaz's crew had been asked only to certify Diaz's courage and seamanship, Columbus' crew was asked also to certify Columbus' geography. The deposition that all were required to sign declared that the coast they had sailed 335 leagues from east to west was longer than any island they had seen, that therefore they were certain that this coast must be part of a continent, which was obviously Asia, and that if they had sailed farther, they would have encountered civilized people of intelligence who know the world. Columbus threatened to prove it by continuing the voyage until they had circumnavigated the globe. As an additional argument, Columbus explained that anyone who refused to sign would be fined 10,000 maravedis and have his tongue cut out. If the obstinate sailor happened to be a boy, he would take 100 lashes on his bare back. The return of Columbus' ships to Spain in March 1496 was anything but a triumph. He was warmly received at court, but the discovery of islands of the Indies in the Western Ocean no longer created a sensation. Like a second moon landing, Columbus' feat had somehow been minimized by showing that it could be repeated. Except among a few men of learning, word of this voyage was received with indifference. One reason surely was that the commercial payoff for the large investment had been so negligible. Some of his closest collaborators were beginning to doubt that Columbus' Indies really were Asia. Juan de la Cosa, who had been master of the Santa Maria on Columbus' first voyage, and was with him too on the second voyage, had actually signed the required Cuba no island deposition. But when La Cosa made his famous world map in 1500, he showed Cuba as an island. Dubious European map makers for many years showed 2 Cubas, one an island, the other conforming to the shape of Marco Polo's Mangi as the mainland of South China. The multiplying doubts of others hardened Columbus' obstinacy. The admiral named the first coast he touched in Cuba Alpha and Omega, reported the chronicler Peter Martyr in 1501, because he thought that there our east ended when the sun set in that island, and our west began when the sun rose. He expected to arrive in the part of the world underneath us near the Golden Chersonese, which is situated to the east of Persia. Now it was only with difficulty, and after 2 full years of promotional activity, that he collected a fleet of 6 ships for a third voyage to depart on May 30th, 1498. New rumors and reports already suggested that a great landmass, perhaps not Asia, might lie somewhere to the west of the islands Columbus had found. But Columbus was not impressed. Instead, he was more eager than ever speedily to find the sea passage around the Golden Chersonese into the Indian Ocean, and so vindicate his hopes. On this third trip, he encountered some geographic conundrums, which led him into fantasies that would discredit him among the best cartographers of his age. The faith of medieval Christian geographers was still very much alive in the mind of Christopher Columbus. On this voyage, his first discovery was the island he christened Trinidad in honor of the Holy Trinity. Then he happened into the Gulf of Paria, the bay formed by the delta of the great Orinoco River. Until then, it had been an article of his faith that there could be no land mass down that way. But how explain this great freshwater sea, and the breadth of the freshwater rivers that poured into it? Was there, after all, a land mass not found in Ptolemy, which gathered this great flood of fresh water? I believe that this is a very great continent, until today unknown. Columbus recorded with surprise in his journal. And reason aids me greatly because of that so great river and freshwater sea. And next, the saying of Esdras, that the 6 parts of the world are of dry land and 1 of water. Columbus the Zealot was not unprepared for some grand new revelation about the shape of the planet. God made me the messenger of the new heaven and the new earth of which he spoke in the Apocalypse by St. John, after having spoken of it by the mouth of Isaiah, and he showed me the spot where to find it. This revelation required revision of the orthodox dogmas of the earth. Columbus had always been a man of deep faith, and he saw his voyages as a divine mission. His determination to find the Indies was not just about personal glory or wealth. It was about spreading the Christian faith and bringing the gospel to new lands. Despite the growing doubts and the increasing challenges to his theories, Columbus never wavered in his belief that he had found the Indies. His third voyage, while groundbreaking in many ways, did not provide the definitive proof he needed. Instead, it led to more questions and more uncertainties. The Orinoco River and the Gulf of Paria were significant discoveries, but they did not align with the geography of Asia as described by Marco Polo. Columbus' insistence on interpreting these findings through the lens of his preconceived notions began to wear thin. The fourth and final voyage of Columbus, which began in 1502, was marked by even greater challenges and setbacks. By this time, many of his sponsors and supporters had lost faith in him. The voyages had not yielded the expected wealth, and the new lands were proving more difficult to colonize and govern than anticipated. Columbus faced numerous obstacles, including storms, shipwrecks, and conflicts with both the native populations and his own crew. Despite these challenges, he continued to explore and map the Central American coast, hoping to find the elusive passage to the Indian Ocean. Columbus returned to Spain in 1504, a broken and disillusioned man. His health was failing, and his reputation was tarnished by the failures of his voyages. He spent his final years in relative obscurity, petitioning the Spanish crown for recognition and rewards for his discoveries. He died in 1506, still believing that he had found the Indies.